Okay, so now we're going to talk about abolitionists, armed resistance, and the lead up, the beginning of the Civil War, basically, the American Civil War. Most abolitionists in the United States in the 19th century are going to be a type of abolitionists that are actually going to discourage armed resistance of enslaved Africans against slavery, and even the quote, more radical, unquote, forms of protest in literature, such as David Walker's Appeal. Many of the people who are abolitionists are not necessarily, have racially egalitarian views. Many of them actually wanted to, send African people or people of African descent, quote, back to Africa, unquote. And some of them were quite at a kind of, they were not innocent of the kind of paternalistic racism that a lot of Northern whites had. Maybe not, and a lot of Northern whites actually had this outright hatred, but abolitionists tended to not have that. They tended to be reformers who generally wanted to improve societies in other ways as well. There are a lot of utopian societies around in the 19th century, especially the first half of the century, such as the Shakers and the Quakers and all these other groups. And temperance was an issue a lot of them also believed in, right? Prohibition of alcohol, suffrage for women, right? Women getting the vote. There was a real diversity of politics and motivations around abolition. Abolitionists mostly grounded their opposition to slavery in the Constitution and the Enlightenment language of equality, liberty, and individual rights. They also tended to harness the biblical language of deliverance from bondage and what we would now call evangelical Christian ideas. So they were African Americans and they were white. They were quite a diverse group of people. And their politics varied. So one of the more well-known of the abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison. In 1831, he started a newspaper called The Liberator. And this is, again, because of rapid print technology, widespread literacy. It was kind of unprecedented that to be able to get this kind of literature out to the masses, but he did. Southern newspapers and Southerners were quite fearful of what he was doing, and they were quite infatuated with it. And very foolishly, they would reprint portions of it in Southern newspapers just to show how extreme these abolitionists were. Of course, enslaved Africans were reading these things, and that this was actually giving even greater notoriety to the Liberator. So these factors kind of combine to really help spread the reach of the Liberator as a newspaper. Harriet Beecher Stowe was another individual, very well-known abolitionist, because again, she used the print to reach so many people. She wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. It was widely read and it helped expand abolitionist sentiment. It was an international bestseller, and Queen Victoria even reads it later on. And again, it was a criticism of the Fugitive Slave Act. Tried to humanize African American people in the person of Uncle Tom, this beloved kind of elderly black man who was loved by his owner's family, but eventually is beaten to death. But he's a very benign, kind of passive, elderly man that, whites could kind of sympathize with his character. But she also had like kind of the mammy figure and all the classic stereotypes that whites had of African Americans, yet it did galvanize people's opinions against slavery. And it presupposed, right, that Africans did have family ties to whites and suffered as a result of their bondage. So again, it was a kind of critique of racism. It was packaged in such a way that it could really bring out sympathetic feelings in whites towards Africans who were enslaved. Charles Sumner was a Massachusetts senator and abolitionist. He was infamous for being the victim of a caning and assault by a fellow senator, Senator Preston of South Carolina. He was an active abolitionist, began his career as a congressman, spent it actively campaigning against slavery and the national government, and later on for full political rights for African Americans after the Civil War, when the 13th Amendment ends slavery and the 14th and 15th Amendments are passed. Now, Frederick Douglass, another, well, here he was, of course, born as an enslaved man. He was actually of mixed ethnicity, and he believed that the man who owned him was probably his father. In 1845, he penned an autobiography of his experiences as an enslaved man that, again, very widely read. It was called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an Escaped Slave. And it talks about how he separated from birth from his mother, how he knew his father to be a white woman, and talks about how the children were raised like animals almost, like puppies, right? He becomes a so-called city slave, and that he's leased out to the docks in Baltimore to learn to be a carpenter to build ships and this sort of thing. His mistress begins to teach him to read, but the person who the people who are leasing him, her husband basically stopped that. He was able to, after that though, to learn to read and write by basically tricking young white kids into teaching him. He got a hold of a text and a copybook and basically taught himself to read. Kind of a really interesting example of individual resistance to slavery. At one point, he writes about how he fought back against the whipping, and it kind of awakened this political consciousness in him. In other words, this man was hired to break him by physically beating him, and he stopped the man, but the man didn't want to let it be known that that was the case because he would have lost his reputation as someone who could, break an enslaved person who was being recalcitrant. I put a question mark next to the year of birth because he never really knew exactly what year he was born. But he escapes from bondage in 1838, doesn't disclose the method or any of the way that he took, again, because he didn't want to, kind of disclose that information to folks who might, be trying to find out how people are getting out of, particularly Maryland. He's this brilliant orator. He writes of the whippings, the killings. He writes about drunkenness being encouraged in slaves during the holidays and how, giving enslaved people liquor and then watching them behave in the way they did kind of reinforced the stereotypes that whites wanted to believe about enslaved black people. He also argued that slavery corrupted white people as much as it corrupted, as much as anyone, right? And the example he gave was of his white mistress who was inclined to be kind to him, but kind of discouraged from that by the husband, but also kind of bought into the rationale behind not treating him as a human being. August 1841 begins his activism as a abolitionist. His narrative is published in 1845. This is a really great speech he makes regarding the 4th of July in 1852. You should go to YouTube and listen to this when you get a chance. It's quite compelling and interesting to listen to. So, although he begins with William Lloyd Garrison in 1841, he gets out from under the authority of white abolitionists because he felt, first of all, they were too paternalistic and they often lapsed into the language of reform, where he was militantly opposed to slavery. He was anti-slavery, but he's also anti-racist. He believed in the equality of blacks and whites. He really believed he wanted to see a country where blacks and whites lived together equally. Most white abolitionists wanted slow reform. They feared direct confrontation or violence. They were always telling African Americans to be patient, and Douglass just was not having that. He was militantly opposed to slavery, and he felt it was worth going to war to end it. And again, like I said, 100% anti-racist, wanted economic, social, political, economic equality with white people. Now, the Underground Railroad, very important feature and institution of abolition. It was an informal network, of rather clandestine routes out of the South, run by ex-enslaved people, abolitionists, religious minorities such as the Mennonites and the Quakers. About 3,200 people were involved in this using various roads, trails, and secret hideouts. African Americans and white Americans took part in this. The majority of people actually were probably white Americans. Approximately 100,000 of these people passed through Philadelphia, right? So this is basically going through Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, all the way up into Canada, in fact. And a lot of African American churches, particularly the African Methodist Episcopal Church, they were pillars of this movement. In 1850, however, the United States federal government is going to respond with force, right? And start using armed troops to break into homes and snatch up runaways because of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, of course, Harriet Tubman is most closely related, right, in history and in common knowledge with the Underground Railroad. She escaped from slavery also from Maryland in 1849. She made her way to Philadelphia, where she settled into a free black community and was making a living, doing housework and this sort of thing. But she decided to return to Maryland to get her sister. And just kind of after that, she became dedicated to the mission of freeing as many enslaved Africans as possible, returning over and over again. In 10 years, she probably escorted around 300 people out of enslavement. In 1856, a $40,000 bounty was put on her head for her death or capture. She became known as Moses, quote unquote. Again, Africans having adopted the biblical language and concepts that frame the resistance. During the Civil War, she actually acts as a spy and basically a scout or engaging in kind of reconnaissance and reporting on troop movements. And at one point, she helps to organize and basically not quite lead, but organize a raid that frees hundreds and hundreds of enslaved people. John Brown, now another one, an anti-racist, another pretty famous abolitionist, an anti-racist, which was pretty rare in his time period. Fathered 20 children over this course over several marriages. I think few of his wives died quite young. He was a real Christian patriarch, a deeply religious man, had been a militant abolitionist since the 1830s. He was an enthusiastic participant in the bloody conflicts that are going to go on in the Kansas territories during the 1850s, which we're going to talk about. At one point, he slaughters 5 men with a broadsword in retaliation for a raid upon abolitionists where people had been killed. He was a deeply religious Christian. His anti-slavery beliefs were grounded in the language of the Bible. He hated slavers and hated slave owners and recruited whites and African Americans alike. He was very much committed to armed struggle against slavery. And so in Kansas, and this is where John Brown really becomes infamous, the land west of Missouri is split into the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is basically sponsored by a Democrat, Stephen Douglas out of Illinois. Basically, Congress and the Senate decide on a vote, a popular vote on slavery. So Kansas Territory becomes this bloody flashpoint for sectional conflict. Again, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, sponsored by Senator Stephen Douglas, really endangered the 1820 Compromise, which had said no slavery above the 3630 line, which is the southern border of Missouri. As you could see from the map, right, Kansas is just west of Missouri. It's above that line. Technically, according to the 1820 Compromise, it should not have been in any question that it was going to be a free state. But again, this is the South really pushing the envelope. And again, thinking of slavery as this is their property and thinking about how the Fifth Amendment and the Bill of Rights protects their property, right? Um, this is Senator Sumner at one point gets up in the Senate and makes a speech, the quote, crime against Kansas speech, unquote. And he insults Senator Douglas and accuses a man by the name of Senator Butler of having an African American mistress. And his cousin, the cousin of Senator Butler, a representative in Congress by the name of Preston Brooks, attacked and severely beat Senator Sumner with a cane. I mean, Brooks was censured and forced to resign, but he was reelected, and he was a hero in his district. And whereas Sumner was unable to return to the Senate for quite some time, he was so injured, and his empty desk sat as this kind of symbol that infuriated Northern Southerners that such a thing could happen. And this is how you see kind of this polarization is really beginning to take place. So, in terms of Kansas, you had these so-called free soilers who didn't want slavery, but also weren't necessarily fans of African Americans. They just didn't want slavery in the Kansas territory because they're farmers who didn't want to compete with plantation owners, right? And you're going to have other individuals, who are coming there from the South, who are coming there with slaves. Again, they want to form a significant demographic of Kansas so that in the 1848 election, they could vote for slavery. And this area becomes known as Bleeding Kansas because there's going to be so much violent sectional conflict during this period. Free Soilers are going to be the people who form the basis of the Republican Party. Again, the abolitionists, as Free Soilers, as well as mostly from South Carolina, pro-slavery men, are going to be coming into this territory to try to establish themselves as majorities. So again, these factions are flooding the region over this issue of popular sovereignty, this upcoming vote on whether the state will be free or slave. And again, it's going to lead to incredible amount of killings, both retaliatory and defensive and offensive. Anti-slaveries are eventually going to prevail by 1860. So fall of 1855, John Brown comes to Kansas. His sons had come before him. They wrote of basically what was a guerrilla war going on as thousands of pro-slavery Missourians were coming in and thousands and hundreds of pro-slavery South Carolinians. They were passing draconian laws limiting abolitionist activities. These were called the quote, black laws, unquote. There was a death penalty for aiding escaped slaves or aiding slave insurrections. There was a law that said printing literature to make enslaved people dissatisfied would get you 5 years in prison. So, John Brown comes out there and again organizes his sons and organizes free staters and established very public profile as not only as abolitionists but as militant abolitionists. And on May 26th, um, he basically commits what's known as the Potawatomi Massacre. Basically, May 26, 1856, John Brown and his sons, in retaliation for a raid by pro-slavery forces on some abolitionists, they went and selected five pro-slavery men and executed them with broadswords. And again, he really makes a reputation for himself. By the fall, however, of that year, he does leave from Kansas with a more complicated plan, which we'll talk about, to actually end slavery. January of 1861, Kansas is admitted into the Union, however, as a free state. So as I said, late 1850s, John Brown has made it back to to Northeast, basically comes up with an idea to basically start a Haitian Revolution style insurrection to end slavery. And so basically his plan was to raid a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and he recruits formerly enslaved Africans, and free blacks, as well as white men, to basically be fighters and travel to Harper's Ferry and attack this federal arsenal. The plan was to take control of the arsenal and the weapons in it and start liberating plantations and arming people, right? And it was it's interesting plan. He attacks the arsenal with 21 men. Again, he intended to provoke an uprising. The uprising never came. And it's kind of a military failure. They're basically trapped in the arsenal. Most of them are killed and or taken prisoner. And again, John Brown is executed for this, right? And one of the officers who led basically the counterattack that captures him and his men was an officer by the name of Robert E. Lee, who's later going to command the Confederate Army. John Brown is executed. The raid's a military failure, but it's a major propagandistic victory. It brought him great admiration from the North. And even people who disapproved of his violence admired his dedication. But it also heightened sectional tensions as Southerners were pretty dismayed by his popularity in the North. And this is when John Brown is kind of a wake-up call to Southern whites. This is when they really begin to strengthen their militia system. The Southerners become even more entrenched in their views on slavery, especially the plantation owners. White Southerners, again, even most whites didn't own slaves. Didn't own. The vast majority of slaves were owned by a small group of people. There were a lot of whites who wanted to own them or would own one or two and aspired to own more. But even impoverished whites seemed to kick it in with the plantation owners. Very strong attachment to the Second Amendment in the southern states. And again, the Amendment is used to articulate their position regarding states' rights, which is kind of a contradictory thing. Because on the one hand, they say we should have the right as states to maintain slavery. On the other hand, they're telling the non-slave states that don't want to do that because that's their state right, that they have to protect their right. In other words, that if a person makes it to a free state, they still have to aid the Southerners in pulling that person back into slavery. Many people saw that as a contradiction. And again, what happened with John Brown is positioned as a potential, quote, invasion, unquote, of the South by outsiders. So the Dred Scott decision, again, going to heighten tensions even more. In 1847, Dred Scott, a man who was enslaved, sued for his freedom based on the fact that his owner had taken him for years into territory in which slavery was prohibited, Illinois, Wisconsin, and stayed years there and never allowed him to be, and kept him enslaved. The case was in lower courts for 10 years. The Missouri court ruled against it, and it went to the Supreme Court in 1856. However, 7 of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court were appointed by pro-slavery presidents. 5 of them were from slave-owning families. So it's not surprising that when they issued their ruling on March 6, 1857, that basically Justice Roger Taney, who's the author of the opinion, the Dred Scott decision, basically says that, quote, slaves are not citizens, quote, so they can't even sue. And he also says that the 1820 Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that slavery cannot be prohibited anywhere, right? And he says, furthermore, says that a person of African descent has no rights which a white man was bound to respect. So he basically was saying that slavery could be anywhere, right? And this really is going to, again, really upset free soilers, abolitionists, and even people, again, who were not racial egalitarians, but did not want slavery in their states, right? Um, yeah, and again, white supremacy is kind of in this ruling, white supremacy is recognized as a principle of the founding fathers and foundational in terms of rights and citizenship. That's what he's saying. He's saying Africans everywhere in the United States are non-citizens, and theoretically, people could be enslaved anywhere. These people could be. So again, abolitionists respond with rage and chagrin, and this is when the Republican Party, this around the same time, they've been founded a little bit before this, but they definitely find it unacceptable and becomes their party platform to oppose this decision. So again, yeah, this is it. White supremacy, the law of the land. I mean, that's what the Dred Scott decision is saying. Africans are non-citizens. Slavery can be expanded anywhere. Again, the abolitionists respond with, even more militancy. The Republicans respond by making it part of their party platform to basically not follow this ruling. So Abraham Lincoln, who was morally opposed to slavery but rejected social and political equality with Africans, even free blacks, is going to become president in 1860. He was a back to Africa advocate. He was an advocate of sending enslaved people back to, again, back to Africa. I put in quotation marks because many of these people had been on the continent longer than a lot of the people who were white, quote unquote, right? Some had been here before the founding of the nation. He also was a fan of gradual emancipation. He had no intention of ending slavery if he was elected, even though he had a moral opposition to it. The Civil War is going to change his mind. And it's really an open question if he embraced the idea of total and complete equality, but he certainly embraced the notion of total and complete emancipation. So in the election of 1860, Stephen Douglas, the Illinois Democrat who'd sponsored the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is going to run for the Democrats. Again, he's an expansionist. His idea is that popular sovereignty, right? That each new territory should vote on it, right? Again, the result of that in Kansas was incredible bloodshed. And he's going to lose to Lincoln. He'd been in the Senate since 1846. He was not a slaveholder himself, but again, was sympathetic and again saw this as a compromise, letting states vote on it. Lincoln, however, is going to carry the election, even though he's not even going to be on the ticket in most of the slave states. The Republican Party platform basically included a repudiation of the Dred Scott decision. And again, Lincoln, while personally against slavery, he was willing to compromise with the slave states to preserve the Union, right? Southerners weren't really, Southerners were all about expansion. Their feeling was like that the Supreme Court had spoken, it's done. His victory is going to begin the process of the Southern states leaving the United States, quite frankly. Lincoln is going to be unyielding in his position that he's not going to allow slavery to expand westward. So again, when our next lecture, we'll start talking about the Civil War. But again, we talk about abolitionists. Many different political stripes. Some were quite passive. Some were actually quite racist. Others were quite militant, like John Brown. The Fugitive Slave Act really put teeth into the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution. It forced local governments, local officials, local law enforcement, even local citizens to assist slave catchers in ways that it had not before. It created a lot of rage and bitterness in the states that didn't allow slavery. Dred Scott kind of seals the deal. And I know Southerners probably felt like this was the end of the discussion, right? But the Republicans and states that did not allow slavery are not going to go along with this. But certainly there's this feeling being articulated from the highest court in the land that white supremacy is the universal principle of the republic, right? And I mean, this is something that, that people in the United States are going to have to reckon with for the next, 150 plus years, in fact. John Brown and Bleeding Kansas is kind of the beginning of the Civil War, right? We see kind of this conflict in Kansas in the 1850s. It's going to culminate in Harper's Ferry. And the election of 1860 is going to begin the secession of the Southern states, leaving the Union to form the Confederacy. And this will lead us directly to the beginning of the United States Civil War.